Welcome back. My name is Andy Russell. I'm from SUNY Polytechnic Institute. I'm a historian of standards and of maintenance. So this panel picks up quite nicely where the first panel left off, demonstrating the value of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. One could argue that data law's value and impact comes from those traits. So the panel that we're about to hear extends a discussion into the world of standardization, which is itself also an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary field. We have a paper on data standardization, portability and interoperability in an interconnected world. Michelle Gall from University of Haifa and Dan Rubenfeld from NYU Law will be presenting. They'll have about 10 or 15 minutes. Our commentators are Scott Hemphill from NYU Law and Daniel Francis from the Federal Trade Commission. Please take it away.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, and I want to start commenting and thanking the organizers of this wonderful conference and a very timely issue. And the paper that we're going to present today is part of a broader project which aims to identify the conditions which shape the data ecosystem in order to ensure that we enjoy the benefits that the information economy brings about, while at the same time overcoming or at least reducing its harmful effects. And this specific paper that we're presenting today focuses on the technological obstacles to data sharing, which might affect the efficient uses of the data and limit the creation of data synergies. So let me start with the motivation for the paper, because the motivation arises from the fact that data volume has reached literally astronomical proportions. We're talking about 43 billion exabytes by 2020, and the World Bank attempted to characterize it or create a vision of it, and he said it's like putting a stack of reports reaching from Earth to Pluto, a lot of data. And there are significant benefits in just such voluminous data. The size and quality of data affect the knowledge that can be mined from it. And partly this is because data analysis is often characterized by economies of scale and scope, at least up to a point. But furthermore, the size and the quality of the data also affect the quality of the algorithm. And once you have a better algorithm that learned in one data set, it can then carry this kind of learning to another data set, which might perform completely different, might be very different. This is what we call transfer learning. So how do we ensure that we have good data sets? The challenge arises from the fact that much of the data is collected and organized in a system that is largely modular and distributed, a fact that by itself has a lot of advantages. For example, just to think about the IoT, it is envisaged that by 2020, 30 billion IoT devices, that's the Internet of Things devices, controlled by numerous market players, will be hooked to the internet. And this is in addition to other forms of data collection. Yet those who collect the data are not necessarily the ones who can benefit from it. We heard about that in the last paper as well. And I think even more importantly, when combined with other data, its value might increase exponentially. And I like this quote from Mario Schoenberger in Padua, who said that data is like a single puzzle piece that taken by itself offers little value, but when combined with others to complete an image is turned into something precious. So just to illustrate what we have in mind, consider medical data on patients' responses to a treatment for a rare disease. If data were shared among its collectors, it would be easier to learn how best to treat the disease. Now, one of the problems is that we have a lot of data sets, but they do not talk to each other. So you can think about it a bit like a Babel tower of data sets that we currently have. And what are the problems? Why is there a problem in data interoperability? Well, there are at least three main problems that data scientists identify. The first is what you might call metadata uncertainties. Metadata is the data about the data. Okay, this is the data which tells you, it describes what kind of data you have in the database. For example, what metrics you use, what exactly was measured. So metadata uncertainties limit others' ability to understand what different data points signify. For example, was the medicine administered in cc's? How often did you take the patient's temperature, etc.? The other kind of technical problem with data interoperability has to do with obstacles to data transformation. That happens when you have two data sets which are structured differently or are internally organized differently, and then you have to put them together. Now, it might seem like an easy problem for you. I can tell you that this is what my husband does in his career, okay? I mean, there are many people who do that. It's a real big problem. Oracle, Amazon, other firms have spent millions and billions of dollars on trying to figure out how to combine data sets which are completely different. And another problem, the third problem, is what we call the missing data problem. And this is a limitation which is probably most difficult to correct, and it arises when some necessary data was not collected, and it is difficult or expensive to collect it at a later time. So this Babel Tower of databases can create problems for data sharing, and some of these problems can be solved through data standardization. So what is data standardization? First of all, a very broad definition. It involves setting standards that relate to the data value chain. That is, it might relate to collection, to organization, to storage, to use, for example. And data standardization can reduce the problems that we just talked about. For example, it reduces metadata uncertainties by requiring that data semantics follow certain norms and rules. In China, for example, they have a standard for ideograms for information exchange to ensure that the tens and thousands of Chinese characters used in all databases are similar. It can also reduce obstacles to data transformation. I'm sure that many of you use Google Maps or you use MoveIt, and these have a standard behind them on how to collect data about public transportation. And it can also reduce the missing data problem by setting standards for data collection. Just to give an example, the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology sets standards for the collection of observation regarding patient health, for example, with regard to allergies, just to enable broader learning. So is data standardization necessarily justified, even if it increases users? Many of the common rationales for standardization apply to data. For example, the compatibility standards increase interoperability of data, they lower switching costs, they limit duplication. At the same time, the costs which are regularly connected with standardization also apply to data, most importantly lock-in to an inferior standard and switching costs. Yet, what we argue in the paper is that data standardization raises new considerations that are generally not relevant to other types of standards, both costs and benefits. And sometimes they increase the size of some of the costs and benefits that are related with standardization of other assets. So we identify 5 such considerations. The first is that by widening the use of data, standardization enables cumulative and synergetic knowledge production, which may stimulate new and better products or services. Yet because of its transformative potential across many diverse spheres, data standardization raises issues that go well beyond economics to the moral, to the social, to the political spheres. Just take, for example, facial recognition. Facial recognition has become much more much better in the last few years, thanks to big data, to voluminous data. Now, it can, of course, be used for good. It can be used to detect terrorists. It's used in the Amazon Go stores. But it also enables spying on others. And I think an interesting example is that in China it is used to shame jaywalkers because their pictures are taken, they're identified, and then they're displayed on big billboards with their names. Okay? So the same technology. So accordingly, we cannot separate considerations relevant to data standardization from the potential current and foreseeable uses of data-generated knowledge. However, I think that since effects cannot always, the different effects cannot always be separated, and not all future users of the data can be perceived, it might be generally better to prevent certain uses of data-generated knowledge rather than prevent the knowledge itself, unless we think that we cannot prevent the harmful effects once the knowledge is generated. The second specific consideration has to do with improving the learning from available data, because standards can also affect what one can learn from data, regardless of whether it's shared or not. And the paper uses an example of an SQL standard for organizing data, which was inefficient, and it took the industry many years, it took about 20 years, to move to another standard, to a better standard, that the idea was there, but the problem was that there were a lot of sunk costs by the major database vendors, Oracle and IBM, who then limited the ability of the market to move to a better standard. Another consideration, which is unique to data, has to do with the effects on data collection. How does standardization affect data collection? Well, it may increase competition by expanding the potential, because once you expand the potential uses of the data and facilitate data integration, you, of course, increase its value. Once you increase its value, you increase, of course, the incentives for collection. And also, where firms can easily integrate external data into their own data sets, the market can become even more decentralized, at least with regard to some types of data. It also increases competition in related markets. Just think about a smart home. The data on the operation of different appliances must be integrated in order to create that smart home. And the ability to integrate these data will facilitate entry into markets for home appliances. Standardization would also affect the type of data collected, because it reduces the incentives to collect duplicative data if you can use somebody else's, but it increases incentives to collect unique data. Another considerations, of course, has to do with privacy and cybersecurity. These were mentioned before. I will just say a bit about that. Cybersecurity, of course, and it was said before, there's a vulnerable consolidation point where if the database is very large, it creates much stronger incentives to hack it. And that's on the one hand. On the other hand, when you talk to experts of cybersecurity, they say that the more data you have, the more you learn about its structure, and you learn about some attacks, and you can then maybe prevent. So it goes actually both ways. With regard to privacy, these are very important concerns that have to be taken into account when we talk about sharing data. However, not all data is private data. Okay? We tend sometimes to have that as an example, but it might imply that the costs and benefits of data standardization might differ among different types of data. And it also implies that standardization must be accompanied by some safeguards. There might be legal, technological, even cultural, that ensure that its overall effects on social welfare are positive. And finally, there's an international dimension here, because the war over database advantages is not confined to domestic markets. And I think that Russian President Vladimir Putin put this bluntly. This is uncharacteristic of him. And he said that whoever leads in artificial intelligence would be the ruler of the world. So data standards can actually affect the international competitiveness of domestic firms, either facilitating or restraining it. And it adds another dimension to data standardization.
So I want to spend about 5 minutes talking about the possible role of government that flows from the discussion that Michal just had. And there is no single simple answer, but if I could quickly generalize for 5 minutes, I'd say that our view is that a lot of the data standardization issues that were raised basically tend to increase both the benefits and the costs of standardization. So there are going to be some cases where a lot of the benefits and costs will all be internalized within an industry, in which case we probably don't need to think about certainly about intervention. Initially, we may have to, in fact, later on look at the standardized body or organization to see whether there's some externalities generated. But I'd say in most cases there are likely to be externalities. There are going to be benefits of forming some kind of standardized body or institution, and to generate those externalities, we are likely to need to have public intervention of one kind. And that's particularly true when the benefits of standardization go across industries, and even especially true when they go across nations, which is often the case. So we have to start thinking about exactly what are the bodies that either ought to advise or actually have a more active role in helping to monitor and to, in fact, in some cases, regulate these standardized organizations. In other cases, once organizations are formed, because there are often huge benefits to creating standardized data bodies, we have to start thinking about the market power that flows from the control of those large data sets. And of course, we've all heard a lot about that subject generally in recent days as various institutions around the world are starting to look at companies like Google and Facebook. Now, when we start thinking about the role of enforcing and possibly intervening for competition purposes, we're tending to talk about organizations and data arrangements that have been set up and already generated market power. And then the question has become, do we need new institutions to jump in to somehow deal with this problem or even deal with the governance issues that arise? And just to preface the discussion, since I know I have one active and one former enforcer about the comment, I want to make clear that our view is that there's no reason why the handling of these data standardization externalities and enforcement issues cannot be handled within our current institutional framework within the U.S. That is, we have broad powers of our public agencies, both at the state and the national level, to look at these issues. And my view and Michal's view is that in terms of the actual enforcement from an antitrust perspective, we can work within the current confines, but we have to be creative. We have to think about how to build our analyses of institutions and how to enforce the current arrangements in a pretty creative way. But I'm comfortable myself believing that we can do that successfully. When we go to data standardization issues that go across countries, then the issue becomes more difficult because we don't have any existing organization with any statutory authority to play the role of overseeing that kind of regulation. We do have some lessons to learn in antitrust from the International Competition Network. There's been no statutory authority for that institution, but in fact the institution has found ways to work together to develop common interests, and even are starting to look at ways to actually make the process work more effectively. So I can easily imagine, with respect to data standardization, pushing the ICN or a new institution to start thinking about how to achieve a regulatory environment for handling both the huge benefits and the huge costs that come from effective standardization. Thanks very much.
So thanks for the chance to talk about this really valuable, fascinating paper. I really got a lot out of what I think of both as the Michal point and then the Dan point. The Michal point about the pros and cons of standardization, data standardization, and then the Dan point, which I think is more descriptive than prescriptive about the options that a regulator has, from best practices to incentives for adoption and all the way up to mandating adoption. It's a big range. So I want to offer just a quick thought about framing, principally around the Michal part of the paper, and then a couple of ideas as time permits about how to maybe push the analysis further. On the framing, I totally take the point, I think it's right, that some of these pros and cons are deeply familiar from other standardization contexts, switching costs, lock-in. Others, not as much. Certain specifics of data collection, the nature of the synergy between products and so on. I think the most distinctive, no surprise here, is going to be the privacy piece, right, compared to other kinds of standardization. One thing I wondered, though, as I was reading through it is, you don't need, for the interest of the paper, for data to be super new and different in kind. And so I think pressing that as like a really important thing to get across, I might downplay. I'm almost more interested in the ways in which the synergy is deeply similar to other things that we've seen. The connections are more interesting to me personally than the sharp distinctiveness. And given that you don't need that to make your points, I might throttle back on that just a little bit. In terms of places we might take the analysis, I don't think I'll get through all of these, but a thought on forced sharing, a thought on privacy, on the policy trade-off between regulation and markets. So we'll see how far I get. So with respect to forced sharing, you guys are very clear, you're not doing a forced sharing paper, right? We talk about data standardization, we don't want to talk about forced sharing. But the points are pretty, right? The pros and cons of standardization, the pros and cons of forced sharing have a close kinship. Made me wonder where you guys come out on forced sharing. I think this is a very raw paper about standardization, about trying to identify standards. And so it then made me wonder, how many of these arguments could I pull over to that other, more fraught, at least from the standpoint of antitrust policy, more fraught context? Second, with respect to privacy, I want to connect this in particular to the Kosian trade-off that you all talk about. I think it's at page 20. It's kind of make or buy decision. One of the happy benefits of data standardization is that it makes it easier to contract across firm boundaries, and so you could achieve scale and the other kinds of benefits of standardization without having all the data inside the same company. So that sounds great. You can probably see this going. There's this other dimension, namely that contracting across firm boundaries, is going to make privacy leaks more likely if we think that more institutions having data, the same data makes a leak more likely, or if you think that just, contract isn't a perfectly effective way of maintaining privacy, of maintaining confidences. I think the Facebook experience with Cambridge Analytica should be in our head as we say this, but it's a general issue. It helps, I think, emphasize the way in which data standardization is special, I would say, in some tension with what I said a minute ago, right, is special with respect to privacy because it has a big effect on how we think of the make or buy decision. Now, if standardization does have this kind of odd and hidden downside, it does lead us down this road toward, on the margin, preferring big organizations that keep all the data in one big pile. We have reasons to be uncomfortable with that too. So I'm not saying there's some clean answer here, but I think on the margin it's a factor that I think fits very congenially with the paper you already have, and it might be worth spending a few words on. Third, barriers to entry. So you guys already talked about this a little bit. I was very interested in your all's reactions to the extent to which data standardization might have an impact on barriers to entry, not in the data business itself, but in the stuff that sits on top of it. So standardization, I think, is good news for Internet of Things, small third parties offering novel appliances that do something with the data. I just wanted to just spin that out a little bit more. It reminded me a little bit of the debate over Amazon Web Services, where we think of AWS as being, gosh, a tough business to get into, given that Amazon is so good at it and so big at it, and these returns to scale. But then that's not the only business or industry to care about. Obviously, web services also enables all kinds of innovation from everybody that wants to use it and now has cheap access to flexible, powerful computing power. So I don't know what the data story is here well enough. I don't understand the attributes of these businesses well enough to give you a clear and close analysis. But I wondered what you guys might be able to say about the lowering or even increasing, if that's where it comes out, barrier to entry in these adjacent markets. And then finally, with respect to markets versus regulation, which is kind of I don't know how they wrote it, but I'm thinking this is a damn part of the paper because that's the order in which they presented it. Markets versus state regulation versus private non-market solutions. I'm going to add that on as a third. So you lay out a bunch of options. I would love, I don't think this would take much work, I would love to see in there a little bit more specificity, maybe a worked example that would help think about how effective markets are at supplying standardization. I get the point that there's a commons issue. There's probably a variety of issues that make markets not perfectly effective. But I wanted to just hear a little bit more about when we would expect the commons problem to be severe, when we think state mandate would be at its strongest, right? So if you're not offering a clear answer in a specific case, can you help work me through the levers that make one better or the other worse? And beyond markets and beyond state regulation, what about private associations or private intermediaries with a profit motive? To what extent could they be expected to supply data standards as an alternative? So with that, thank you for the excellent and thought-provoking paper.
All right, well, good morning. I'm speaking just for myself today, and so my comments don't represent the views of the Federal Trade Commission or of any individual trade commissioner. So if Scott focused on directions in which this paper might travel, I want to focus on what I take to be its core claims. So in data standardization, we have a sketch of a problem and then some outlines about what a solution might look like. And I read Dan and Michal as making 4 main claims. So the first is that there are huge gains available from promoting what I found myself thinking of as data liquidity, and which they refer to as data interoperability and data portability. I think they make a compelling case for the value that's available there. The second is that they claim that this is impeded today. This value is locked up, its liquidity is impaired because of inconsistency or incompatibility among data sets that exist out there in the world held by different actors. And again, I think they paint that picture compellingly. So on the statement of the problem, I think we have a wonderful outline of the challenge that confronts us. Where I start to have some skepticism and where I want to sound some cautionary notes is with respect to what we are offered as the solution. So the third and fourth claims seem to be, third, that standardization, even in the near to medium term, is really a promising solution for these difficulties. And the fourth is that that standardization can realistically be pursued, again, at this stage, on a cross-industry basis and with a government regulator playing a leading role in the process. So again, I think this is a wonderful statement of the problem, but I really want to sound some skeptical notes about the solution. So it's clear from the paper, and it's clear from the rich information that underlies it and from our experience every day, that data liquidity promises tremendous value in the ways that Dan and Michal outline. But I have real skepticism about the notion that these problems can be solved with cross-industry standardization, or that a government regulator at this point is really well placed to lead that process. So we know that the advantages of standardization can be formidable. Standardization unlocks efficiencies of scale and scope. It can prevent waste. It can increase output in the standardized markets and in upstream, downstream complementary markets, reduces transaction costs. And we know that that story of gains is qualified in practice by, as they point out very accurately, number one, risk of lock-in around an inefficient standard. And number two, the familiar antitrust evils, right? Collusion and exclusion that distort the standard setting process. And so we apply that to data. And here's the first of my skeptical notes. I have some gentle skepticism about the notion that data is really special for purposes of this discussion. And I agree with what I take to be Scott's point, that the authors here don't need to show that data is special in order to show the value that standardization can unlock. So we're painted a pretty clear picture where interoperability and portability, data liquidity, if you like my term, can create a whole ton of value, and it responds specifically to very precise problems that we have identified for us. So, number one, where we suffer from uncertainty in the market about what metadata really means, we can specify a consistent standard. Where we find barriers to transformation from one data set to another, we can specify a common metric. And where we have what we regard as incomplete collection, we can simply specify a standard. Now, in principle, who would disagree? I think it's clear that when that can be accomplished, gains will be unlocked. The question is whether, as we look at the world today, there is something important that we can do, should do, and are not doing. So the authors recognize that there is tremendous existing voluntary work going on out there that amounts to data standardization. And in fact, this has been going on forever. In addition, they recognize that some sectoral regulators, in particular in healthcare and transportation sectors, have played a role, a valuable role, in encouraging this kind of data standardization. But they would have us go further. They argue that it's time for a general data standardization agenda that reaches across industries, and they invite us to consider a government regulator to take a more intensive role in acknowledging, evaluating, and perhaps treating data standards. So I would just say 3 things in response. Number one, I think the basic case for standardization applies compellingly to data in many specific cases for the reasons the authors identify. Although again, there's my gentle skeptical note about whether the data story is different, but of course it doesn't need to be for us to see the prospect of real gains. The second comment is where I start to become intermediate level of skepticism, if I can put it that way, right? I have moderate skepticism here. Because I think expecting standardization to solve the problems that the authors identify really assumes away the problems that lead to those difficulties in the first place. So I don't think the real gap between the world we're in today and a world of more efficient data liquidity relates to the externalization of benefits from standardization. I think it's more complicated. I think what we're really seeing is a function of the fact that, number one, different market participants value data in radically different ways, use it for radically different reasons, and value very different things in their data sets. Data needs are diverse, they're rapidly changing, and they're contingent on technological and commercial realities that are changing at a tremendous pace. And in addition, data sets, and even the need for data is often a matter of great commercial sensitivity. So these things are often confidential. They're often proprietary. These, I think, are not promising circumstances for cross-industry standardization, and certainly not cross-industry standardization that's managed or supervised by a government regulator. What we'd expect instead is that in very concrete cases, where there is advantage to be gained from standardizing or harmonizing the treatment or flow of data, the market or the participants with the incentives and ability to do so will find that themselves. And in fact, there are a number of those stories in this paper. EDI standards for delivery of goods packages in Berlin, right? National standards for diagnosing or observing allergy patients. These might not be glamorous stories about big data, but I think they are concrete examples of the kind of benefits that the authors would have us realize. So what undermines, just to sort of to come to my third and final observation, what underlies my reaction here is some skepticism about the notion that data as such is a unitary subject about which it's particularly productive to have a meaningful analytical discussion. because I don't think that data is a unitary phenomenon for which a regulatory response can be calibrated at the level of all data. So at one point in the paper, the authors quite interestingly compared data with oil as the basis for our economy, but I really don't think data is very much like oil at all. Oil is pretty straightforward, it's pretty knowable, it's pretty homogeneous. Data is a word that means all relevant facts. I'm not sure we have a noun that is broader than the word data. So what the authors identify as inefficiencies in need of a solution might really just represent differences in what we, collectively and individually, value about information. So your missing data might be my unnecessary measurement. Your incommensurate metric might be my best measure for my need. Your metadata need isn't going to be my metadata need, and your minimum quality standard might be my waste of resources. So finally, the paper would have this centralized process be supervised by a government regulator. And I just want to read what it is the role that the regulator would discharge here. The regulator should, quote, understand the implications of their decisions on all market players, evaluate whether industry standards are economically efficient, and assess whether the market would develop timely and efficient standards, and would also ensure that the broader social implications are given due thought. That is a heroic set of responsibilities to devolve on a government regulator on a cross-industry basis with a remit running, by definition, across the variety of categories of data and demands for data within even a single supply chain are formidable. Within an industry, astonishing. Across an industry, unimaginable. And to place a government regulator in the role of identifying and curating the process of shaping standards in a top-down approach to finding the solution to these very real problems, it strikes me that the authors might do a little more work to convince us that these are not insuperable problems. Thank you.
Some response from the authors before moving to questions?
Should I start?
Okay.
Thank you so much to both of you for these wonderful comments. And let me start with the bottom line. Let me start from the some of the comments that were made last. We do not say that data is similar for all users. It's definitely different, and we actually make the point in the paper that different data sets are used by different people. So the point is that you should, there are some instances, some governments, some industries in which sharing of data might be extremely important, and data is collected by very different market players, and it cannot talk with each other, even though we would like it to talk with each other. So it's definitely not the point that we need one regulator for all data. It's like we're very cautious, I think, in our approach, saying that we should at least think about it, at least in different settings. And I think that the Chinese are one step ahead of us, because what the Chinese are doing is that they have already identified 10 industries in which cross-industry data is really important. And they have started creating these data sets which are based on common standards. And these are autonomous cars and smart cities, and medical data, and other areas. And they have recognized that there are many players in these industries which would not necessarily sit together and create a standard. So I think that just starting to think about these issues is important. That's actually, as far as we're going, we're definitely not saying that somebody should standardize all the data in the world. Another point is that with regard to private incentives, with regard to standardization, one of the problems is, and I think that you hear it from a lot of data scientists, is that the ones who collect it do not necessarily know what the value of the data is once they're collecting it. So if that is true, sometimes thinking one step ahead and trying maybe to create methods or just thinking about standardization of at least some aspects of the data might be helpful. And just think about the health industry, which was not, the data was not standardized for, at least not among the big players. And what happens is that now you see an attempt to create standards which costs billions and billions of dollars, where you try to create, to put together very different digital or handwritten notes about treatments of diseases and other types of data that could have been prevented if we just thought about it before. So again, it's not that we need a data regulator for all data in the world, but I think that the point we're making is that there are some industries and some settings that I think it's important to identify in order to start thinking about data standardization, because it is a problem with regard to data, to some databases. With regard to governmental role, again, there are many options here. And I do not envision the government itself setting the standards by itself. There's a very important, I think, synergy between government and private firms trying to sit together to think about these issues. And some of the examples that we have in the paper actually show that private firms do not necessarily create efficient standards, even when they have very strong incentives to do that. Okay, so I think that just identifying these and going forward with them can have a tremendous value, especially if you add the international dimension and you think what the Chinese are doing, and you want to stay in the game. So there are so many other points, but I'm going to stop here.
Okay, thanks, Michal. I'll be relatively quick. I thought both commentators were terrific. I really appreciate their comments and suggestions. I want to just respond a little bit to Daniel's skepticism, which I think is appropriate, but by giving an example which I think will partly counter some of what he said and partly explain why he's right about his skepticism. So about, I'd say 5 years ago, I agreed to serve on a National Academy of Sciences panel whose job was to look at digital preservation. That panel spent 2 years working together. It included representatives from a broad array of industries, the movie industry, music industry, the publishing industry, a huge group of people with particular industrial concerns, people from high tech, low tech. It was really an interesting array of people who got together we all got together many times over a 2-3 year period, and produced a report, by the way, which is available on the web. It's all public. And what was striking to me about the work on the panel was that we were able to take all these industry players and get them together, and we had an immense amount of agreement. It took 2 years of talking to get there, but the people from all these different industries actually pretty much were on board as to producing a common agenda for the kind of issues to work through and to deal with. That's the good news. So it led me to be pretty optimistic about how parties can get together to deal with these cross-industry issues. Once it came to the issue of what to do about some of the recommendations, then the skepticism turned out to be supported, because when we went, this was during the Obama administration, when we went to Washington to talk to the various regulators to see whether they wanted to sort of jump in and help deal with the next phase of these issues, we didn't get very far. And then secondarily, when it turned out, when we had concluded, as I think would be obvious, that to the extent there are broad externalities, positive externalities, and to the extent that digital preservation is a problem that is really quite complex, it needs funding and monitoring on a fairly continual basis, there needed to be either private or public financial support. And to this point, as far as I know, there's never been this really too much success on the private level to raise the money to get some of the preservation activities ramped up. And secondly, there has been no interest that I'm aware of for any of the agencies that would be interested in digital preservation to really jump in and put their budget to really deal with these problems. So in the end, I tend to be an optimist about these things. I actually think we can overcome some of these problems, but I think it's appropriate that we be very skeptical as we work through them. Thank you.
Thanks for teeing up some great issues for the audience to weigh in on. Do we have comments or questions?
Answers?
Or answers? Yeah.
Thank you.
And please tell us who you are.
I'm George Contreras from the University of Utah. So thank you. This is a fascinating panel and an area that's near and dear to my heart. I mean, I would respond first to Daniel by saying that there is a word broader than data in the English language, and it is property. And we'll talk about that in a future session. But to the point of this panel, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of standardization. But there is a difference in, what I've observed in the Chinese and the US model, which is the Chinese model is more of a top-down planning model for standardization, whereas in the US and Europe, it's basically been an industry-driven, market-driven process. And, in the healthcare world, just to focus on that as an example, right, we do have standardization where it's been needed by the private sector. So the example are the CD9, CD10 codes for Medicare. Reimbursement. Everybody has to submit their reimbursement requests to Medicare, and Medicare only wants to look at one set of codes to determine whether or not they're going to reimburse. And the market needed that. And so, this is a highly imperfect system, heavily criticized for many, many reasons, but it is standardized. Whereas with medical records more generally, the large healthcare providers, there isn't yet a market need for them to standardize. From a social planner perspective, yes, it would be perfect if they were standardized. But what's lacking there is a market need. It's not essential for Kaiser and Geisinger to be able easily to exchange their data. Or even if they have to, it's not worth the $1 billion it'll take each of them to convert to a new format. When they get a patient who comes over from the other plan, they'll do it manually or just have the patient, fill out their records again or something like that. It's a much cheaper alternative. And so I guess what I want to see is a demonstration or at least an argument that we should replace the market-driven nature of standardization that's used here with a more top-down public planner, social welfare perspective, and how that gets paid for, right? Because these are hugely expensive projects, and people have been talking about this medical records for 30 years, right? And it still hasn't happened, and I think the reason is that the players don't see a compelling market reason for it to happen yet.
Thank you so much. This is an important question in an important area to all of us, probably in medicine. And I want to actually talk a bit about the HITECH Act, which is a relatively new, and it creates best practices for standards with regard to medical records. And the idea is that just take a rare disease, okay? If different hospitals or different doctors record different data parameters. For example, one takes the temperature every 2 hours, the one takes the temperature every 24 hours, one only feels how the skin feels and whatever, then we would not have the necessary data, or it would be very difficult to put together data with regard to how, for example, patients react to a rare disease. So one of the ideas was that there's a public benefit in creating standardization for that. So instead, because, and I think that the healthcare industry is also a very good example because it's an example of path dependency. because because each one of the players is using very different standards. So what do you do when you see a public benefit from putting together the records about rare diseases or whatever? So what they did is they created soft standards, and they're actually using all kinds of incentives, payments, for these market players in order to then create data sets that can talk with each other. So one of the points that we're making is that if we can identify some of these instances in which the public benefit is very large, we can avoid the path dependency problem early on. We can, that's actually the point that we're making, that you have to look. It's definitely not standardization for all. But the point is that there's some instances in which data standardization is important. And here, this is an example of a regulator who stepped in the medical industry.
Thanks very much for the really interesting paper. I guess I wanted to maybe pick up on something Daniel had mentioned in his comments about what's different about data. And that is that it's, I think, as Daniel pointed out, it's not just not easily identifiable, but it doesn't have a common purpose or a common goal necessarily, in that different unrelated pieces of data can be recombined, reused, and so forth in a way that other things that, like oil, may not be.
Right.
And so I guess the one element of maybe risks of standardization that I didn't see in your paper, and that is what is lost through standardization. Because creating data standards, and I think I read your paper to understand that you're really concerned with technical standards, but of course those rely on an infrastructure of other sets of standards in terms of how one and what data one collects. And so what gets lost in that new infrastructure that will be required for those standards? What doesn't get captured? And whether the kinds of things we lose actually may affect the net public benefit that you talk about. And I keep thinking about this in the context of the work that I know, which is in the context of development, humanitarian work, sustainable development agenda, where there it's actually the reverse problem, where national statistical commissions and the UN Statistical Commission have very clear standards about what counts as statistical data that the states report along various reporting obligations, treaty bodies, and so forth, and for the sustainable agenda goals. But those standards actually don't capture everything that one wants to know about the state of poverty or education or whatever. And there's now all these other organizations that are willing to provide the data. We have big data analytics, and the statistical commissions are pushing against that data use because they don't comport with those standards. So that's, I'd be curious on your views on that. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I think those are excellent comments, and actually we have not, in the paper as it stands, we really haven't fully acknowledged that issue. So I think you make an excellent point, and we will revise accordingly. I'm just thinking myself about instances where what you said would be the case. So we have work to do.
Right. Let me just add to that standards can be a minimum. I mean, you can collect more data, but one of the problems, and you're right, one of the problems is once you have a standard, you might tend to treat it as, this is the data I need to collect and no more.
Hi, I wondered if you might be able to elaborate a bit more on Scott's point about the sort of force sharing being quite close to the line where you're taking a standardization argument. And it was useful that you just explained again about that rare diseases example that I think is really driving the paper considerably. But I'm just a bit concerned. It's I've tracked, principally outside the US, a lot of the arguments around centralized medical data repositories, and it's often led by this sort of prototype example that, look, there are these people in scattered locations with discrete bits of information. If only we could put them together, we would be able to solve disease. And I think if that argument is going to be driving it, you need to address resistance to the whole broader consequence of those data aggregation schemes that sort of follow on that example, and particularly if that really is that really the reason why advances aren't being made on those rare diseases, that, you know, they're taking them over different timescales? Is standardization really the block? Because I think there's a sharing issue that's discrete from the data issue in that context. So,
I think you're definitely right. I mean, and we say it in the paper that standardization can solve the technological problems with sharing. It doesn't create the sharing itself. So you actually, these are two issues which are connected, and Scott, you so rightly put them, you know, you pushed us on the question of forced sharing. The paper does not have a strong stance on that. We actually say that standardization is important, even if you're looking at the market with voluntary sharing of information, partly because, as we show in the paper, and when we use quite a few examples, the market does not necessarily always create the best standards, or create any standards at all, even if there is even a private justification for that, and not even to say if there's a strong social justification for that, which is not taken into account. With regard to forced sharing, I would be, again, but this is beyond the paper, I would be very careful with forced sharing because of the incentives to collect the data, and in the first place. However, I think that with regard to very, very rare types of data, where the public benefit is so extremely large and the private benefit is so small that there are no strong incentives to do that, you might find yourself in a situation where you would do that, but I would be extremely careful with that. Dan?
I agree. If you haven't read the paper, at least the paper, as we drafted it, was really mostly focused on raising these questions, and so raising questions and suggesting possible answers, but certainly not advocating one line in particular. So actually the comments just made and other comments I think are very helpful, because we in fact, when we rewrite the paper, we will probably make it clearer that the concerns that are raised by standardization are very complex. They vary from industry to industry, and there's no simple answer to what should be achieved. And I do agree that we have to worry that if we push standardization very hard, particularly on a global basis, we may lose a lot of individual information that could be quite valuable. So we have to be very cautious as we move ahead. Thanks.
I pick up on that point, which is what to do, because I really enjoyed the way that this conversation has moved from a regulator should to insisting that we should at least think about it, because the benefits are so great and the costs are so great as well. So I wonder if you might change gears to emphasize that part. We should at least think about it. And there's a few different models that come to mind. One you mentioned, a National Academies type study. That might work well, especially given the political economy that George and Daniel and others have raised, that you know, in the United States, asking a federal agency to lead the charge, you know, might not work so well. The other model is, in the paper they mentioned NIST, which I think wouldn't fit in as a regulator necessarily, but as a facilitator of standards development.
Right.
That's really their role. Its private sector counterpart, of course, is ANSI, and ANSI's role is not to dictate standards, but rather to facilitate and harmonize existing standards. So to the point about statistical standards before, an ANSI-led process would have to be driven by industry partners and funders, and then would also have a mandate, I think, to uncover some of these obstacles that then could be, you know, considered, and you could see the viability of inter-industry on different scales and in different topics. So I wonder what you might think about those normative suggestions.
I think it's definitely in line with what I think. I don't see the government sitting down and determining by itself the standards. it's out of its reach, doesn't have the necessary information, it would be very problematic. So actually the word facilitator of standards, once you decide, I mean, I see it as a three-step process. The first one is just thinking about whether you need standards at all and where you need them and where the market won't create them. So the first step is trying to figure out where there are market failures with regard to standards. That would be the first step. The second step is then asking what would be the best way to create the standards. And mostly, I would say, rarely would the government set the standards themselves, but even if they do, you need the participation of the market. You need to be a facilitator is a wonderful word for that. I completely agree. And the third one is once you agree on the standards, how do you create incentives for their endorsement or for their adoption? And as I said before, one way that was adopted was by creating financial incentives. Another one is to put them in procurement contracts, so that, and that actually has created standards in some industries. But there are other ways, and it's not necessarily that there's one way fit all. Much of it depends on the private incentives to adopt the standard versus the public incentives and how much they diverge.
Yeah, thank you. I think my question relates with this last point about the governance model of this standardization. Especially I wanted to know, like, which model have you considered for this standardization to take place? And especially from the perspective of inclusion, yeah? I think it's very important to consider biases and many other things that can happen during this process. So how do you think things like that should be addressed in such a point in which there is a diversity of opinion and also there is an inclusion on the way these standards are created? I think that will be pretty important. And I will also like to say that I will be a little bit more precautious and careful with this arms race, yeah, between like comparing the Chinese model, the American model, and trying to consider that this standardization is vital for the United States and its industry not to lag behind and everything. But I don't know if the risks have been properly addressed, especially on the standardization and how, but if it's biased and if not, it doesn't consider the inclusion process, it can actually, have a lot of problems and especially lose the diversity of data that you have. The data, I think there is some wealth on the diversity of data, and perhaps that can be lost in some point if there is a very aggressive standardization process. So I wanted to know your opinion on those points. Thanks. It's all yours.
You're right with regard to biases in regulatory, in some regulatory settings. I am not sure here, and again, I would love to talk about it more with people or to hear your opinions. I'm not sure that with regard to the choice of the regulatory instrument, data is different. So I think that a lot of the literature with regard to how you set standards in other industries is relevant here as well. And it's true that data has, it strengthens the costs and the benefits, and it has different, and privacy and cybersecurity might be, for example, much more important here. But the basic literature about the government failure versus market failure in regulatory settings, I think, has a lot of relevance here as well, and has to be taken into account. Data, I don't think makes it special.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Michaela Klein from Audible International Public Policy, but speaking for myself. So first, I guess just one, I agree with your last comment about how I don't think that data is so special, especially given, I think in some cases, cooperation on data may be easier than in other places, given that I think technology, the industry in general, it has a bit more of a cooperative, it had more of a cooperative beginning, and I think that cooperation and reaching beyond borders and things like that, it is a bit more baked in than it may be in other industries, and so that maybe would support that. In listening, I think it's a really interesting discussion. In listening, I think that I question whether or not current international standards organizations are really equipped to handle some of what you're talking about. I think that at the national level, at the regional level, in the US and in Europe, I think that there certainly are standardization processes that may work where government and industry and civil society work very well together. But as someone who used to be on the international standard organization circuit, I think that I wonder whether or not some of those organizations can really address some of the issues that you're raising. And I also am thinking about some of the intersection between public policy and standardization organizations and where some of that tension currently lies. I think that we're seeing in in some cases, governments trying to use standardization organizations and standards as justification for stricter laws, especially in the privacy realm and cybersecurity, or at least using those as reasons for laws in those areas. And I would be remiss to not bring up the International Telecommunication Union, whether or not you believe that's a standards body or not. I think that there is a real tendency for governments to bring in technical standards into that body and then use that as justification for having an international reason to produce laws in their own countries. And so, I'm not exactly sure what my question is in all of that, but those are all things that I'm thinking about in hearing. I think standardization is very critical to solving a lot of the challenges, but I wonder in the technology space and with our current structures, how effective that can really be.
So I was going to start off by saying I appreciate your comments, and actually I have a question for you. But so the question arises, for example, if we look at the development of various standards that allow us to all have our smartphones functioning, there are a number of international standard bodies, many of them that have been involved in producing standards that make our cell phones work. And from my point of view as an outsider, a lot of that's worked quite effectively. So I wonder whether you could just talk a little bit more about what you see as some of the problems that have arisen with respect to some of the international standardization bodies.
Sure. So I think that I think that those bodies, especially given like their emphasis on a bottom-up approach and on building consensus, and also on identifying the areas where, like you talked about before, the areas where interoperability is necessary, and then standards therefore become necessary in the markets. I guess I see more on the front of. I think that the very nature of those bodies is, rests in the assumption that cooperation is essential and that bottom-up process is the right approach. But I think that in the technology space right now, there is a tension that exists between whether or not that bottom-up approach is really working from a public, and whether or not more top-down a more top-down approach is necessary. I think anyone in the United States would continue to argue, and technology companies would argue that bottom-up approach is working very well. But I think for around the world and with a lot of countries, they're looking at standards not from an interoperability standpoint, but also bringing in their protectionist views, bringing in their security concerns, and thinking about and really conflating a lot of those issues together and bringing them into those bodies. And so I think that in their purest form, sure, standards organizations can and will continue to do a lot, but I think that it's becoming harder and harder to separate the purely technical from the political and social. And I worry about the future of those organizations. And even when you look at just the issue of privacy alone, the technical organizations are supposed to be looking at sort of the way to secure data, and in that are addressing the issue of privacy, right? Data as the technical aspect that you need to affect when you're considering privacy. But when government wants to address privacy, they're thinking about the content of that data. Technical looks at just data as data, not necessarily what it is. Government wants to know what the data is and put restrictions on how it's controlled based on the actual content. And I think that, technical organizations are not very well equipped to deal with that particular issue. And I think that the more you bring regulators into that, that's going to be the issue, and so I see those as some of the issues.
Thank you. That's your response very helpful. I appreciate it.
But there's also the old issue of anticipatory versus reactive standardization, and in general, standards have been more effective if they're reactive.
Right.
Anticipatory standards, as you know from studying mobile, is littered with failure.
Right.
Time for one more question.
Okay, I guess that's me. Thank you for this insightful panel and for this, proposition. Two comments that I would like to share with you and get your insights on are, first of all, for me, the greatest, one of the most, positive arguments you can raise for why we need standardization is already happening. It's happening by design. And we see it with companies introducing privacy compliance tools in the aftermath, of course, of GDPR, with tools like Big ID, for example, or other tools in the field of security that seek to basically identify where are the most sensitive information. So through technology, and of course we also see it that, database architecture, is it NoSQL, SQL, for the purpose of interoperability, we need technologies to operate on the same, type of infrastructure. So already by design, standards are being made, but they're being made, as the common argument, by Lessig, by others. They're being made through technology, and maybe that is why we need standards that are actually, put together through thought, through regulation, through policy making. And this is going to happen very fast. We already see it. Already, in 2 years, the growth of the market of GDPR compliant products has created a lot of this type of self-regulation. So this is just one, line of thought. The other point is I think cybersecurity is actually, and I've seen it, of course, in the paper as an argument, it raises, of course, vital concerns, but it's actually an area where standards has been the most prominent form of actual regulation. If you look at the NIST framework, the most popular framework, self-regulation, of course, multi-stakeholder processes. We are now seeing other laws coming into place with security by design in California and the like, but self-regulation has been the prominent mode of actual regulation and enforcement in that field. And we see it also with respect to information and information sharing and the importance of information sharing with respect to vulnerabilities, ISACs, and the like. So I do think that actually cybersecurity could be a positive argument for why we need this line of thinking.
Thanks very much. These are two thoughtful comments. Just, I would say that everybody that collects and organizes information uses an internal standard. So if you think about it, any database is based on a standard. Okay. So, but the idea is to go beyond the firm. And you rightly said, it's done through technology. And the idea here is because the technologies for the internal standards are different, they cannot necessarily talk with each other.
Yeah. I would just add that what we are seeing right now in the industry, at least, that because of cloud computing and the like, there is definitely a need to go beyond just the internal process. So you have like big companies like, for example, Google with their cloud platform Azure, AWS and the like, setting the standards because everybody needs to be compatible with their platform if they want to work with industry. So to some extent, exactly like we have seen with IP, with copyright in other arenas, these are like the biggest regulators.
I completely agree, and if you look at what Amazon has did, one of the problems of Amazon entering into cloud computing for these databases, big, large databases, has to do with standardization. It has to do, and again, this is another issue which is connected, but it's standardization which is based on IP. For example, Oracle is saying that once you organize the data in one based on its internal standards, you cannot then take the database and transfer it to a cloud which is operated by Amazon, creating competitive problems. So again, you're very right. Thank you.
Last word to our organizer.
So I don't want to keep anyone from lunch, which is an important standard for conferences, but the comments by Scott and Daniel really prompted in me again the question that I put to you when I read your draft for the first time, how your approach to data standardization relates to portability. Because in your presentation, you very much emphasized the interest in companies of moving data around and aggregating data, but there's a different way of conceptualizing data portability, which is the way the GDPR goes. So the GDPR has this provision, Article 20, that gives users the right to move data from one platform to the other, say. And it has this interesting feature that this is subject to technological possibility. And I'm wondering, in light of the question that Scott raised, how much is this market-driven and how much is this regulation-driven? What your thoughts are about this kind of regulatory intervention in light of the data transfer project, which is a project by big tech companies that you mentioned in your paper to enable user data portability from one platform to the other. So would this project have happened without this nudge from the GDPR? And what's really going on there? So is it realistic that a user moves its social networking operations from Twitter to Facebook? Are these really comparable platforms in the end? Or is this an attempt to incentivize data standardization framed as enhancing user rights, but really improving interconnectedness between platforms and getting users to consent to data transfers via API connections between them?
I was just going to say, I think you've outlined our next paper because you've raised a lot of interesting questions which we haven't fully confronted in this paper. Michal will actually give you the right answer.
This is a great question, and I think that you packed a lot into it. And one strand here, it has to do with the way that regulation can then affect things that are not necessarily, well, they might have been intended, but not necessarily. So I think that's a great point here. Another one has to do with standards that are created, and you gave the example of the GDPR. The GDPR, for example, requires that if a user asks you to transfer his private data, you have to do it in a form which is portable. Okay, and what does it mean? What kind of standards are created there? Who would create the standards? Are these going to be the big firms, and are these going to be the standards that are best for them but not for the small ones? If that's what's going to be happen in the market, is that good for competition? Would that create market power? So isn't it better that somebody step up and think about these issues in the beginning? This is exactly what we're saying.
Let's thank our panelists for a wonderful session.